Susan had always considered herself a cautious mother. At 40, she was raising her baby boy Roy on her own. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like, and share this video. Life hadn't been kind in love, but motherhood had brought a new kind of meaning and joy to her quiet routine. She worked from home, enjoyed nature walks with Roy, and occasionally ventured to the local coffee shop to break the monotony. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady and safe. At least, it had been until the morning she noticed something terrifying. It was just after sunrise when she leaned in to adjust Roy's blanket and saw him rubbing at his nose again. He'd been doing that more than usual, but what she saw next made her heart plummet. His tiny nostrils weren't red or runny. Instead, the skin inside and around them was marked by dozens of tiny, perfectly round holes. It looked unnatural, as though something had burrowed into him. Her breath caught. What could cause something like this? Fighting panic, Susan tried gently pressing around the area, but Roy cried instantly and flinched away. She called the doctor without hesitation. The receptionist at the pediatric clinic heard the alarm in her voice and scheduled her for a semi-emergency appointment that very afternoon. They would squeeze her in. All Susan could do now was wait and try not to lose her mind in the meantime. She paced the house, trying to retrace every step of their week. There hadn't been anything unusual until she remembered the hike. Just a couple of days ago, she'd taken Roy into a nearby forest trail. He was teething and fussy, and the fresh air usually helped. Could he have touched something? A toxic plant? A fungus? But what about the date she'd gone on afterward? That was certainly out of the ordinary, too. It had been her first attempt at dating in years. The man, someone she'd met online, seemed nice enough in their messages. But in person, something felt off. He had little interest in her son and seemed distracted throughout dinner. There was a distant coldness to him, one that didn't match the charming tone he'd used in their chats. It was strange, but she hadn't thought much of it until now. Susan shook the thought from her mind. Surely the man had nothing to do with Roy's condition. They hadn't even touched. No, it had to be something from the hike. She gathered her things and made her way to the clinic. The moment she stepped into the waiting room, all eyes turned to her baby. Roy was no longer hiding. His discomfort was listless, quiet. The holes were now visibly spreading down his nose. Inside the examination room, the doctor's initial calm demeanor quickly faded. He leaned closer to examine Roy's nose, his brow furrowing. He'd never seen anything like it, not in practice, not in textbooks. The strange perforations didn't match any known infection or allergy. Something was terribly wrong, but what? He ordered tests and instructed Susan to think back on any unusual contact Roy might have had. While the labs processed the samples, Susan stepped into the restroom to collect herself. She left Roy resting in his stroller, his breathing light and shallow. Minutes later, as she returned, she was met with chaos. The staff was in disarray. The doctor had stepped out of the exam room, clutching a folder of results and pale as a sheet. A specialist had replied to an urgent inquiry he'd sent through a professional medical forum, and the response was alarming. The pattern in Roy's nose matched a rare case another physician had encountered just once, years ago. The diagnosis? A strain of a flesh-eating viral pathogen, likely transmitted through contact with a foreign biological agent. This wasn't just a health scare, it was a biohazard. Before Susan could re-enter the room, she found the door locked from the outside. Trapped with her child inside the examination room, she began to pound on the door, demanding answers. She could hear panicked voices on the other side. The doctor's voice was frantic, calling the authorities. She pressed her ear against the door and heard the words containment protocol and police on the way. Fear twisted her stomach into knots. What were they saying? That her baby was a threat? That she was? Desperate for answers and fearing for her son's life, Susan kicked the door open with everything she had. The lock gave way. Alarms sounded. Doctors and nurses screamed as she stepped out with Roy in her arms. 3 armed police officers rushed through the clinic doors. One pointed at her. "It's them!" Guns were drawn. Susan raised her hand slowly, shielding Roy with her body. Her heart thundered in her ears. She pleaded for answers, sobbing now, desperate. One officer, calmer than the others, lowered his weapon and began to speak. They didn't want to hurt her. They needed her to remain calm and to isolate immediately. Roy was infected, they said. The virus could spread, but more importantly, it was something they hadn't seen in the region before. The doctor stepped forward, his voice shaken with guilt. He apologized for the secrecy. He'd panicked. This virus matched the description of an incident from years ago that had nearly gone undetected in its early stages. They needed to contain it, study it, and treat it fast. The pieces began falling into place. Susan shared every detail she could remember. The hike, the plants Roy had touched, the date, which thankfully turned out to be irrelevant. Authorities traced the infection to an unidentified plant discovered off the trail Susan had walked. It wasn't native to the area. Scientists later confirmed it to be an invasive species likely brought in through illegal trafficking or accidental introduction. Its sap carried viral spores, and young Roy had likely touched or inhaled them. Susan and Roy were taken to a containment unit. Thankfully, the hospital had access to the experimental antiviral treatment needed. Within days, the spread of the virus was halted. Within weeks, Roy's skin began to regenerate. The holes closed, the nightmare began to end. Though Roy's recovery was underway, Susan remained in isolation with him, confined within the glass walls of a high-security medical unit. Doctors and virologists monitored them around the clock, taking no chances. The virus, though arrested, was still being studied. Susan watched her son sleep peacefully, the signs of infection slowly fading, but the fear lingered. She couldn't help but relive those first terrible hours, the confusion, the horror of people recoiling from her baby, the cold gleam of firearms aimed at her over something no one had yet understood. As days passed, officials returned to the forest trail. Using Susan's recollections, they traced the likely area and discovered a small patch of bizarre vegetation, a plant with waxy leaves and a sap that tested positive for biohazardous compounds. It didn't belong there. In fact, it didn't belong to the continent. Scientists believe the plant might have been smuggled in, perhaps by a collector or trader, and dumped in the wild when it proved too dangerous. It had adapted to the soil, thriving quietly until a toddler's curious fingers changed everything. The plant was swiftly removed and the area sealed off. Environmental agencies began an investigation to trace the plant's origin, and botanists issued warnings about the dangers of unregulated plant trading in an underground world far more widespread than most would think. Meanwhile, news of Roy's case began to spread, not as a sensational headline, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how vulnerable human life can be in the face of the unknown. Susan, once terrified to even leave the house again, found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for safe environmental practices and awareness. By the end of the month, Susan and Roy were released from isolation. Roy was whole again, happy, curious, unaware of the storm he had weathered. Susan, though forever changed, walked out of the hospital with new strength. She had faced the unimaginable, not only a mother's worst fear, but a brush with public hysteria and the cold protocols of crisis control. At the local clinic where it had all begun, a small note had been pinned in the staff room, written by the same doctor who'd once locked that examination room door in panic. It read, "Today I learned that fear cannot guide science, and that sometimes the strongest response is compassion, not containment." As for dating, well, Susan decided it could wait. Love would come when it was time. For now, she had Roy, she had peace, and she had her voice. A voice that now spoke with the calm resilience of someone who had looked fear in the eye and come back stronger. But just as Susan thought things were finally calming down, a new twist emerged. A senior botanist working with the investigation team discovered that the foreign plant had likely been deliberately introduced to the forest ecosystem. This wasn't a natural spread. Someone, somewhere, had planted it, whether by accident or with purpose was still unknown. The implications were chilling. How had a dangerous, non-native species ended up along a public hiking trail? And more importantly, were there more of them out there? Susan was relieved that her baby had recovered, but the experience left a permanent mark. She became an advocate for environmental safety and awareness, working closely with local parks and hospitals to educate others about rare plant-borne illnesses. Roy, now healthy and cheerful, became a symbol of resilience and a reminder that sometimes nature hides secrets in the most unexpected places. Susan often tells her story not just as a warning, but as a testament to a mother's instinct and the strength to fight for answers when no one else understands.